All right. Again, my name is Jake Wynn. I'm the Director of Interpretation at the National Museum of Civil War Medicine. Today, we're going to be talking about the Battle of Cedar Mountain in August of 1862, fought on August 9th, 1862. We're going to be looking at the medical aspects of this battle. We'll talk a little bit about the battle itself, give it some context. But we're going to be talking mostly about medical stories related to this battle. A look at who the medical directors were for these armies that are going to engage in fighting near Culpeper, Virginia on August 9th, 1862. I'm going to talk about some medical histories of some patients who were treated during the course of this battle. We're going to talk about a famous woman who showed up on this battlefield in the days after the fight. It's going to go on to change the face of humanitarianism in American history as well. If you do enjoy these videos, please, you can support the National Museum of Civil War Medicine here on YouTube. Give us a thumbs up. Give us a subscription, hit that button in the lower right-hand corner of the screen, subscribe to our channel, and you can support us too by becoming a member of the National Museum of Civil War Medicine as well. So without further ado, let's dive into our topic. I got some slides up here for you all today. I will not be able to see the comment section as we are going through, so please, if you do have any questions, you can drop those into the comments. We're going to address those at the conclusion of the program as well. So let me share my screen here. All right. Hope everyone out there can see this. This is a bit of a visual of what we're going to be talking about today. We're going to be talking about the Battle of Cedar Mountain. And this is fought August 9th, 1862 in the vicinity of Culpeper, Virginia. It's going to be really the largest conflict that is going to be fought directly in that kind of Culpeper, Virginia area. Brandy Station's also going to be fought in this vicinity a little less than a year later. But Cedar Mountain is going to really have an impact on the residents of Culpeper, Virginia. And in this part of Virginia, the central Virginia area and the hills, that is going to play an important role in the Civil War in the summer of 1862. In order to talk a little bit about some context for what we're going to be discussing today, I get to talk a little bit about the battle itself. Confederate forces are going to be fighting in this battle, are going to be led by Thomas J. Stonewall Jackson is going to be leading forces for the Confederate side in this engagement. He had been broken off from the Army of Northern Virginia under Robert E. Lee, which is still down in the vicinity of Richmond, Virginia, holding the line between the Confederate capital and U.S. Army forces under George McClellan that had been backed up to the James River in campaigns that had taken place earlier in the summer of 1862, famously the 7 Days Campaign. So Stonewall Jackson's going to be leading Confederate forces. On the opposite side, we have the Army of Virginia. This is going to be led by a gentleman named John Pope. John Pope is going to be leading a relatively new army in August of 1862. It had just been formed about a month prior. And this army has been created to kind of take some of the power, take some of the forces away from General George McClellan's Army of the Potomac in the aftermath of the defeat in the 7 Days Campaign. John Pope had been a Western commander, had found some success in the West. He's brought east by the Lincoln administration to try to bring some new life, new leadership to U.S. Army forces fighting in the Virginia theater of the war. John Pope is going to have Nathaniel P. Banks leading troops that are going to fight in this battle. So it's not going to be the entirety of the Army of Virginia that is going to engage in this battle. Instead, it's only going to be a piece of that army led by General Nathaniel P. Banks that had already experienced combat against Stonewall Jackson's forces earlier in 1862 in the spring in the Shenandoah Valley campaign. So these are forces, in many cases, that had experience fighting each other. And as this battle will demonstrate, especially when you compare the casualty figures to previous engagements earlier in 1862, this battle shows this is a transition period where these armies have gained a lot of experience already in 1862. As they're fighting against each other, they have become, in many cases, veterans. And so that means that they're going to be steadier in battle. And that means they're going to be dishing out a lot more carnage as well. And you're going to start to see this in the casualty figures we're going to discuss in just a moment, setting the stage for an even larger conflagration that's going to take place later on in August of 1862. This battle, again, fought near Culpeper, Virginia. It ultimately proves to be a Confederate victory. It's going to force John Pope and the Army of Virginia. It's going to set them back. It's going to kind of tear apart John Pope's plans for campaigns in Virginia against Confederate forces. And ultimately, it's going to set that stage for a series of battles that are going to take place further east of Culpeper in the vicinity of the first Bull Run battlefield at the end of August of 1862. They're going to turn the tide in the summer of 1862 and lead to really the first true offensive push that the Army of Northern Virginia under Robert E. Lee is going to carry out in the aftermath of Second Bull Run, ultimately going to take the Army of Northern Virginia into Maryland in September of 1862, leading to the battles of South Mountain and Antietam that we talk so much about, in part because they are medical turning points in the course of the American Civil War, and their casualty figures from Second Bull Run and Antietam were horrific and hellish, leading to and forcing these armies to begin to adapt to battlefield circumstances in regards to battlefield medicine. So that's kind of the context for what we're going to be discussing today. We'll talk a little bit about the wounded themselves and the casualty figures from this engagement. This is a pretty vicious fight, even though the armies are the forces engaged are relatively small in this battle. By the standards of the time, this battle is pretty costly, although it's going to pale in comparison to the battles that are going to come within the 6 weeks after this fight. Confederate forces who do prove victorious in this fight under Jackson lose about 1,300 casualties in this battle. That counts out to about just under 8% of the nearly 17,000 men Jackson brought onto the field on August 9th. Confederate medical officers reported 1,107 men wounded, and ultimately 231 men were killed outright on the field. This counts to about 8% of the Confederate forces engaged become casualties as a result of this fight. U.S. forces, on the other hand, they're going to take a heavier blow. This is a defeat for them as well. They are going to bring about 8,000 men onto the field, and they're going to lose 2,353 of them. That's 29% casualties of the forces engaged by the Nathaniel P. Banks's corps in this battle. That number counts 314 men killed in action. Medical officers reported 1,445 men wounded. Now, that is an estimate. Even though it's a pretty specific number, the tabulation of the wounded in this battle were pretty chaotic. So that is, as the medical director, who we'll get to in just a second, lays out in his report, that is a kind of a guesstimate of how many wounded men they treated in the wake of this battle. And the Army ultimately tabulated 594 men missing from this engagement. Now, that is mostly men who were captured by Confederate forces who are victorious at the end of the day on August 9th. And that also is going to likely count some of the killed in action who are left on the battlefield and who are buried in unknown graves by Confederate forces who do control the field at the end of the day. So that gives you a little bit of an idea, along with the sketch here, this illustration of some of the wounded on the Cedar Mountain battlefield, a little bit of kind of the overall numbers here before we start to get into some specifics, which we're going to do right now. So medical officers who are in charge during this particular engagement. So on the left, we have a man many of you, if you're familiar with Civil War medicine, have at least heard of. He is Hunter Holmes McGuire. He is the personal physician to Stonewall Jackson. He also fulfills the role as the medical director, chief surgeon of Jackson's division at this time, and ultimately, as we move on, Jackson's corps of the Confederate Army, the Army of Northern Virginia. He is going to be the medical officer on the field that day. Lafayette Guild is the chief surgeon and medical director of the entirety of the Army of Northern Virginia. But on the battlefield, McGuire is going to be the chief medical officer there on August 9th. A little bit about him. He was experienced by this point, having served alongside Jackson since basically the outbreak of the American Civil War a year earlier in 1861. By this time, he is 27 years of age. He was a graduate of Winchester Medical College in Winchester, Virginia, where his father was a teacher, played a role in that medical school. Winchester Medical College, interesting fact, was burned to the ground earlier in in the year 1862 by none other than Nathaniel P. Banks's troops. So those who Union forces, U.S. forces on the ground fighting in this battle at Cedar Mountain were responsible for burning Winchester Medical College to the ground earlier in 1862. He was continuing his medical studies in April of 1861, the spring of 1861, at Jefferson Medical College in Philadelphia. When the Civil War broke out, he enlisted in the Confederate Army, ultimately is going to fulfill a medical role, despite his relatively young age. He is younger than many of the medical counterparts who are going to play important roles throughout the Civil War. Your Jonathan Lettermans, your Lafayette Guilds, they are all about 10 years older than McGuire. So he is a bit younger, nevertheless proves himself to be quite capable as a military medical officer. We don't know, unfortunately, a lot about McGuire's role during and in the aftermath of this battle because he does not file a report, which is pretty common for Confederate medical officers, especially at this stage of the war. Oftentimes you'll see just in the official records, you'll see casualty figures tabulated either by individual members of units like McGuire's work with Jackson, or you'll see Lafayette Guild will be the one officially submitting those tabulations. As the war goes on, the effort to try to create a record and reports does become increasingly common in the Confederate Army, but not yet. So what we do know about McGuire is kind of through the context of his talking about his serving on Jackson's staff, because Jackson does pass away a year later from injuries received at the Battle of Chancellorsville under the medical supervision of McGuire. McGuire does write quite a bit about his time on Jackson's staff. So that's where we get kind of more context about McGuire's role in this battle, not from an official report. So unfortunately, don't have a report to go say, I did this at this time and it had this effect. So we unfortunately don't have that kind of context, but also analysis from the Confederate side. His counterpart on the screen, just to his right, is Thomas McParland. Thomas McParland does file a significant report, not only from the Battle of Cedar Mountain, but from all of his engagements with the Army of Virginia in 1862. You can find that in the Medical and Surgical History of the War of the Rebellion, and that report has been included in the link below. If you want to learn more about McGuire, neglected to say this, we also have another article from our blog, from the museum's blog, in the description below. So if you want to read more about McGuire and his role in 1862, you can find that on our website. Again, link below. So Thomas McParland, a little bit about the U.S. Army Medical Director for the Army of Virginia. Talk a little bit about him. He was a native of Maryland, joined the U.S. Army as an assistant surgeon in March of 1849. That is the same year as Jonathan Letterman, William Hammond, several other medical officers who are going to play an important role in the American Civil War joined in that same spring of 1849. McParland is among them. He is of similar mind to Jonathan Letterman. Letterman, for those of you that may not be as familiar with him, is at this time in the summer of 1862 overhauling the U.S. Army Medical Department, specifically within the Army of the Potomac down near Richmond. Ambulance Corps, reorganizing how hospitals are developed and implemented on the battlefield, really reshaping battlefield medicine. McParland is of similar mind. He would love to do an ambulance corps in the Army of Virginia. He would love to have trained stretcher bearers, reorganize the hospitals, but he doesn't have the luxury of time. Letterman, that army is pretty static, doesn't do much in the summer of 1862, licking its wounds from the 7 Days campaign. The Army of Virginia, on the other hand, is very active, starting in July of 1862, right up until the dissolution of that army in late August, September of 1862, it is very, very active. And so McParland never has the chance to implement some of those same ideas. And that means things are going to be pretty chaotic over the course of his experience as medical director. It's going to be some of the very similar problems that had been in the Army dating back to previous engagements, going all the way back to First Bull Run in July of 1861. In his report, McParland cites the chaos of the campaign and the aftermath of battle as Confederates held the field where combat had taken place. He lamented the lack of an organized ambulance corps to collect the wounded and the lack of time that he had to establish organized hospitals. He also stressed concern about where to transport the wounded to after they had been collected. McParland does cite in this lengthy report, again, you can find the full report in the link below, as a link below this video in the description. McParland cites one of his division medical directors reporting on the wounds that they witnessed from this particular fight. This is what they said, quote, "The injuries were in many cases of a severe character, involving the abdomen, arms, and thighs." In the days after the battle, wounded U.S. soldiers were transported to Washington by rail on the Orange and Alexandria Railroad. So that gives kind of the bigger picture medically, and we see that through the eyes of these two medical directors who are serving with these forces that were engaged. And we see them struggling with some of the logistics and the challenges of trying to care for thousands of wounded soldiers who are left behind from an engagement such as the one at Cedar Mountain, without a lot of the benefits that are going to come from later medical innovations. This is very much this battle takes place just before we are on the very cusp of some major medical advancements, but we're not quite there yet. Nevertheless, despite the challenges, there's some pretty remarkable medical care that is going to be administered on these battlefields and in the aftermath. So I have 3 case studies that I'm going to look at today with you all to kind of elucidate some of the medical care that is given not only on this battlefield, but to understand the medical knowledge that was available at the time in the summer of 1862. And so we're going to look at some of these cases preserved in part by the medical and surgical history of the War of the Rebellion, but also through other sources as well. So first up, we're going to talk about a member of the U.S. Army that is wounded during the fighting at Cedar Mountain. We're going to be talking about Private Thomas Dungan, who served in the 46th Pennsylvania Volunteer Infantry. This is a unit that took heavy casualties as part of the Battle of Cedar Mountain, including Thomas Dungan. He was shot in the head. Typically, this is considered a mortal wound. Understandably, they have very little understanding of how the brain functions, but also there's very little they can do if there is significant injuries to the head. Nevertheless, Dungan survives, and his case is going to be recorded in the medical and surgical history, which is a fantastic resource. If you haven't yet looked through the medical and surgical history, it is available on HathiTrust. You can find it by Googling medical and surgical history. That Thomas McParland report is actually a part of the medical and surgical history that has been put up online. So you can find it at that link that I sent you to before. So this is what the medical and surgical history reports on T.J. Dungan, Private Company F, 46th Pennsylvania Volunteers. He received, in an engagement at Cedar Mountain, Virginia, August 9th, 1862, a gunshot wound of the right temple. The bone near the auditory foramen was contused, and the facial nerve was implicated. Now, what that means is basically this bullet did not actually go through his skull. It is going to basically bounce off, likely a spent round that is going to cause a deep bruise and going to have some very serious implications for this soldier, but is not actually going to go into his skull. So this is very important, likely what saves his life. He was admitted on August 13th to the 2nd Division Hospital at Alexandria, and on August 31st transferred to the Judiciary Square Hospital, Washington, whence he was discharged from the service on November 12, 1862. The sense of hearing was impaired and the right side of the face paralyzed. In March 1863, pension examiner J. McCook of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, reported this man's disabilities permanent and incurable. In November 1867, pension examiner E. Swift reported that the sense of hearing on the right side was almost entirely lost, and that facial paralysis existed together with an inability to close the right eyelids. So we have here a patient who is going to be suffering from what is essentially a traumatic brain injury that is going to cause significant nerve damage leading to the loss of his hearing, as well as issues with the right side of his face as well. We actually have an upcoming live stream, an upcoming video that you can find on our YouTube channel that is actually going to examine injuries to the face, specifically with consequences for patients' eyes. We're going to be doing that on September 10th. You can find a link to that video, which will be debuting as a live stream September 10th in the description below. So if you want to know more information about that and those kinds of injuries, you can find that in an upcoming video. We're really excited about working with a professor from Johns Hopkins, one of our newest volunteers at the museum, who's going to be discussing eye injuries in the course of the American Civil War. So Private Duncan, very lucky to survive, but nevertheless going to be suffering for the rest of his life from the injuries received during the Battle of Cedar Mountain. Now we're going to transition over. We're going to bounce over to the Confederate side. I'm going to be looking at a fascinating and also terrifying injury that is going to be suffered by a Confederate officer. You are looking at Richard Snowden Andrews, an officer in the Confederate Army, a native of Maryland who's going to serve as an artillerist during the American Civil War, quite an adept one by all accounts. He was leading Maryland artillery during the Battle of Cedar Mountain on August 9th, 1862, when he suffers a grievous, horrific injury. A United States artillery shell fired across the lines is going to explode in the vicinity of Andrews as he is riding on his horse. When it explodes, it sends a piece of shrapnel through his right side, cutting through his abdomen, and is going to leave a gaping hole in his right side that cut through his intestines, through his abdomen, and leaves behind a massive open wound that is going to very quickly, Andrews will realize, is a very serious, likely mortal injury. He manages, despite his injuries, to carefully remove himself from his horse, falling off the horse in such a way not to further cause injuries, to further exacerbate his already existing injury. And he is going to throw himself onto the ground and immediately be attended to by fellow officers. They're going to be looking at this injury, and they can see this wound has opened up his intestines. His insides have been ripped apart, ripped open, and this wound is instantly looks mortal. Now, there's very little that Civil War surgeons, Civil War doctors with their medical knowledge at the time, especially in regards to cleanliness and infection control, there's very little that can be done for an injury such as this. Oftentimes, injuries to the abdomen, to the intestines are set aside, patients made comfortable as possible, and those injuries will ultimately prove fatal in most cases. This is going to be an occasion where that is not going to be the case, and it is a remarkable story to examine. As he is on the ground, his officers come in, they're helping him to kind of hold his intestines inside him. They're going to be looking at this injury. They're going to be summoning medical officers to come and look. Hunter McGuire is actually among the medical officers who will arrive on the scene with Jackson's staff. They will look at this grievously wounded Confederate officer and deem the wound mortal. All of the Confederate medical personnel who examine this wound all deem it mortal, much to the chagrin of Andrews himself, who is remarkably conscious through this entire ordeal, and in a great deal of pain, as you can imagine. Two surgeons from Georgia are ultimately going to be plucked by McGuire and told to care for Andrews in his agony. They're going to leave behind this description of the wounds. It says, quote, "Snowden was completely disemboweled, his intestines covered with dust, hen grass, sand, and grit." You can imagine what this injury looked like and what it likely smelled like as well. The doctors told Andrews that they could do little to help him, which he had already heard from every medical officer who had examined his wound. Again, remembering he is fully conscious during this situation. He is very frustrated by this point. He understands that his wounds are likely mortal, but he is going to lash out at these surgeons from Georgia. He says, quote, "If you damned doctors would do something for me, I'd get well. I once had a hound dog that ran a mile with its guts out and caught a fox, and I know I am as good as any damned dog that ever lived and can stand as much." To this, apparently, one of the Confederate surgeons there said, quote, "This man is full of all kinds of grit," relating not only that he has sand literally in his open abdominal wound, but also that he is very much has some grit personally and courage as well, and may likely may actually stand up to this particular wound. He is stretchered to a nearby field hospital where the surgeons do next to nothing for him. He's in great pain the entire time. Ultimately, as he is put into a house, a farmhouse, and he is going to be left essentially alone to his devices to die from his injuries. They're going to summon Andrews and the small coterie of officers and also a chaplain nearby are going to summon a local doctor who will come in. And Andrews' wife, who is also summoned and races to the battlefield to care for her stricken husband, will describe that process of what happens when this local doctor arrives. This is what she writes. It says, quote, "He washed out grit and bits of cloth from the wound and proceeded to sew it up, using the only needle he had, which was a rusty one. Then he was placed on the bed, and there was no further treatment possible, except applications of cold water." And this is where the grit of Officer Andrews is going to show through, because he is not going to die from his wounds. Instead, he is going to begin a month-long recovery process. And he is going to ultimately, Confederate Army leaves the Cedar Mountain battlefield in the days after the battle. Andrews is captured by U.S. Army forces. He becomes a prisoner, ends up having to be paroled as well. But he begins his miraculous recovery. And his wife describes it in her a little short memoir. She will write, quote, "It was in the course of 4 or 5 weeks that the great chasm in his side was sufficiently healed for him to sit up. And in 6 weeks, he was dressed and on the porch and able to move about slowly on crutches. At this time, he was drawn down on one side, and he was unable to stand erect for a year and more. His indomitable courage and his fortitude and cheerfulness were unfailing throughout, strengthening all those about him with the hope of his ultimate recovery." And recover he did. By the spring of 1863, he had returned to his unit and was subsequently wounded again, the Second Battle of Winchester in June of 1863. But his luck again held. He survived, and ultimately he went on to survive the war. A pretty remarkable story of survival. With this particular Confederate officer. Again, most abdominal wounds were not survivable during the Civil War era. It takes the good fortune and also the patient's strength to be able to get through many of those injuries if they were lucky enough to survive. So we're going to move on to our last case study here, a little bit of a longer one that we are going to look at now. And this is going to be flipped back to the U.S. Army side, another Pennsylvanian. A gentleman named John Morrison with the 109th Pennsylvania, who is shot through the shoulder during the Battle of Cedar Mountain on August 9th. His case was extensively detailed in the medical and surgical history as an example of a resection or excision, one of the available alternatives to amputation performed during the American Civil War. Yes, there were operations performed other than amputations during the conflict. And important, always have to remember, 95% plus of surgeries performed during the Civil War, U.S. and Confederate, are done under some form of anesthesia. So bear that in mind as we discuss this case study as well. This case is, as I mentioned, extensive. There's a lot of notation here. I'm going to go through the medical and surgical history case notes for Private Morrison. It's very extensive, but gives you very good context for Civil War medical care, how it was administered, and ultimately how in many cases these patients actually recovered from their wounds. So this is case 1509, the medical and surgical history. Private John Morrison, Company F, 109th Pennsylvania, aged 35 years, was wounded at Cedar Mountain, August 9th, 1862, and was admitted to Armory Square Hospital, Washington on the 15th. Surgeon D.W. Bliss made the following special report. The patient had always enjoyed perfect health up to the time of the injury. When struck, he was in the act of firing, the whole arm being raised on a horizontal plane parallel to the shoulder, and the ball took effect in the surgical neck of the right humerus. He walked 1 mile and was then taken in an ambulance to Culpeper, where he received surgical care. The wound was probed and search made for the ball, but to no purpose. Cold water dressings were applied. On August 15th, the patient was sent by railroad to Washington and admitted to the hospital. He was extremely feeble and restless, with an anxious countenance and anorexia, entire indifference as to the situation. Pulse 110, the wound emitting copious sanneous discharge, pus. Examination showed that the ball had produced a compound fracture of the humerus at the surgical neck and plowed a groove along the head, opening the capsule. The ball could not be found. There was considerable depression from effect of wound. Opiates and stimulants were administered and tepid substituted for cold water. August 19th, resection was performed by Surgeon Bliss, assisted by Surgeons Clymer, Brinton, and Breed. The head of the humerus was excised by the V incision, disarticulated, and removed. The shattered end of the shaft below the fracture was taken off with a chainsaw to the length of 1.5 inches, and the spicule of bone embedded in the surrounding tissues carefully removed. The ball could not be found, nor its course traced, but it was supposed to be lodged in the axilla or thoracic walls. The incision was closed by interrupted sutures and a tent introduced at the dependent point. Tepid water dressings were applied. Opiates in small and oft-repeated doses alternated with brandy and beef tea were given. September 1st, patient is improving, pulse at 90. Healing by granulation has commenced. September 5th, the wound is rapidly granulating. The discharge is profuse but of a healthy character. Same treatment continued. September 7th, the arm is dressed with strips of adhesive plaster applied so as to form an easy and firm support. Patient is permitted to walk through the ward. September 16th, patient is still improving. October 1st, patient is attacked with febrile symptoms. The discharges from the wound are less profuse. October 7th, the fever proved to be of the intermittent type, accompanied by anorexia and night sweating. These symptoms were controlled by powders containing sulfate of quinine, ipecac, opium, and tannic acid, one of which was given every 3 hours, and by minute doses of oxide of zinc. October 12th, patient complained of a tumefaction of the shoulder, which on examination was found to be extremely tender. It was small, hard, circumscribed, and situated 1.5 inches below the middle of the spine of the scapula. An incision was made, and a conoidal, ragged bullet was extracted. Some pus of an unhealthy character escaped from the wound. The incision in the arm is nearly closed. October 25th, both incisions are nearly closed, and the general health of the patient is good. The specimen, figure 409, that's the one you can see on the left-hand side of your screen, contributed by the operator, consists of the head of the right humerus excised through the surgical neck. An elongated ball fractured the great tuberosity, crushing in the cancellated structure. A small portion of the anatomical neck is involved. The line of excision is very oblique. The missile is mounted with the specimen. The soldier was discharged from the service December 12, 1862, and pensioned. Dr. Bliss met the man in Philadelphia in May 1865 and reported that he had a useful arm. Examiner J. Neal reported April 27, 1868, less favorably regarding the results of this excision. The Philadelphia Examining Board of 1873, Doctors Goodman, Sherwood, and Collins described, quote, the arm swinging, dumb, and with little power, the forearm weak. So that brings an end to this patient's case note. He does survive the war, goes on to live afterwards, but with the result of a resected arm wound, which means that they've removed this damaged section of bone and left the arm intact. This was an alternative to amputation, often used during the early stages of the Civil War, which they begin to move away from as the war goes on because of complications and also for patient well-being months and years after the surgery was performed. This could be very painful and cause long-term problems for the patients who underwent these excisions or resections. And also, I will note if there is some familiar names in this particular case history, one of them being Dr. Bliss. If you've seen our presentation on James Garfield's medical care during the Civil War, during the aftermath of the Civil War in 1881. His medical care, famously failed medical care, was administered by Dr. Bliss, the same Dr. Bliss who performed the resection in this case. And I do find it of some interest that Dr. Bliss reports this particular patient in 1865 as having a useful arm, whereas the pension boards do find that the arm was useless. So there might be there a bit of exaggeration on the part of Dr. Bliss, maybe a little bit of lying as well. That comes back around during the medical care for James Garfield. So if you want to know more about James Garfield assassination and Dr. Bliss, we have a video posted in the link, a link to the video in the description below if you want to see that particular video after the conclusion of this program today. You can also learn a little bit more about Armory Square Hospital. There's another video down there as well, which you can see a photograph here on the right-hand side. So one more quick story for you all before we turn it over to questions. This is, of course, Clara Barton, someone that we at the National Museum of Civil War Medicine have a particular interest in. We do operate the Clara Barton Missing Soldiers Office Museum in Washington, D.C. That is her home and headquarters throughout the Civil War era, which she used as a warehouse in 1862, storing supplies before taking them out to the battlefield. Well, her first battlefield foray is going to be to Cedar Mountain. She shows up about 4 days after the battle was concluded, and she arrives in U.S. Army field hospitals and begins distributing supplies to soldiers in need, to the surgeons overseeing their care, and really stepping in to help in any way that she could. Her experiences at Cedar Mountain are the beginning of her journey to becoming the angel of the battlefield of the Civil War. She's going to go on to other battles in this campaign, Fairfax Station, Chantilly, and ultimately onto the battlefields of Maryland in the wake of the Cedar Mountain fight in September of 1862 at the Battle of Antietam, where she's going to be on the battlefield as the battle is raging. So Cedar Mountain is where her battlefield journey as a first responder, as a relief worker, is going to begin. So a crucial legacy of the Battle of Cedar Mountain is beginning Clara Barton's humanitarian career in war zones. A remarkable legacy it is for Cedar Mountain. All right, so that is going to bring a kind of conclusion to our program for today. I do want to give kind of a final wrap up here, a little final analysis on Cedar Mountain and its medical history. And that is that it was a nasty fight, a pretty bloody engagement considering the size of the forces involved, that left behind thousands of wounded soldiers. Their care, as we've illustrated in the previous case studies, was commensurate with other battles that occurred in the first year of the American Civil War, as more modern means of medical evacuation and organization had yet to be developed. But nevertheless, they are administering some first-class medical care with the knowledge that they have available at the time. No germ theory at this point in our medical history. So despite the limitations, the medical care actually administered is pretty good considering the circumstances that these surgeons, the medical personnel, the nurses faced on battlefields like that at Cedar Mountain and in the battles that followed. It's going to set the stage for the bloodletting of Second Bull Run and Antietam. And those two horrific battles are going to prove to be real crucial turning points in the medical history of the American Civil War. So this is kind of, again, the prelude to some of those important changes that are still going to be impacting our lives today. So that is going to bring an end to my program today. Thank you all so much for tuning in. If you did enjoy the program, please give us a thumbs up. Go ahead and subscribe to our channel. And also consider becoming a member of the National Museum of Civil War Medicine. You'll support programs like this. You can find a link to where you can become a member in the live chat or in the description below if you're watching this after the fact. So I want to thank you all so much for tuning in with me today, and I hope you've enjoyed the program.